Welcome to the second broadcast of the Full Circle podcast. Thanks to all of you who supported us last week and viewed us on YouTube. We appreciate the support. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, and I have along with me the oral historian, Andre Taylor, and the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes. Guys, we don't have to set the groundwork like we did last week, so we can just dive right into it. You know, we talked already about a couple of topics we want to get into. Let's start with the fact that we lost an icon. We lost a legend, Hank Aaron, Hammer and Hank Aaron. And it's interesting. One of the things that makes this show interesting is that we all have three different perspectives. You know, I can remember Hank Aaron. I was a little kid. He was on the tail end of his career. Dr. Holmes, you probably remember his whole career and, you know, and what he meant and what he went through when he was chasing down Babe Ruth's home run record. I was too young to really know what was going on. I learned about it later. Same thing, Andre probably doesn't remember his career at all, but probably learned about it afterwards, you know, and just what he was as a civil rights hero. So Dr. Holmes, why don't you start us off? Like, what does this mean to us? How should we remember Hank Aaron?
Well, I think we should remember Hank Aaron first as in terms of his profession, baseball. He was a complete baseball player. I mean, he had one of the best. He could hit, he could feel, he had it all, and he also was a great. I say someone who was very active in the African community, in the Black community. When he was chasing that Babe Ruth record, which was like sacrosanct, you know, it was like that thing had been there forever, and here you had this Black man about to take it down. He was receiving all kinds of death threats, all those things, and throughout it he maintained a very calm demeanor. But he was also someone who took a stand, because this was during the period where the movement had been going on, and people were beginning to try to make some transitions in the community in terms of how we dealt with each other and how we dealt with other people, you know. And so he took a very good stand, political stand and social stand around the changes that were occurring, and he spoke out about racism and so forth. And I think it's important also. Just a few days before he passed, we see the Negro Leagues being players in the Negro Leagues being inducted into the Hall of Fame and so forth.
Absolutely.
And he was one. He came up in the old Negro Leagues. And see, when I grew up in a rural area in the country, and baseball used to be the Black sport. and then it's hard to imagine now, but baseball was the Black sport.
I can remember that as well for my generation.
Yeah, man. And we grew up, we had so many baseball teams that were self-supporting, you know. So he grew up out of that. And that was in many ways like the churches and the old jute joints as places that prepared the best in terms of music. Our community taught and trained people to be the best in baseball. So those old Negro Leagues, I often wonder what would have happened if instead of we losing the Negro Leagues, we had three leagues, you know, the American League, the National League, and the Negro League side by side. I wonder how many World Series that Negro Leagues would have won.
Well, but, tell me this, Neil, and that you bring up a good point, and we want to stay on Hank Aaron. I don't want to get too far off.
Yeah.
I know that those Negro Leagues and the major leagues, they used to play games against each other, and the Negro Leagues won many of those games.
Right.
So obviously the Negro Leagues I don't necessarily say had superior players, but they had players that were right on par with the major leagues. So why were Negro League players so quick to run to the major league to the detriment of the Negro League? Was it just money?
Well, it's probably the money. It was the money, and then it was the the idea then of, integration was the big idea that was out there. And although the Negro Leagues was the second largest business enterprise in the Black community, Black players weren't getting the kind of money that the white players were getting, and nobody then was getting the kind of money that people are getting now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, with a different framework, they would have been making the money too, but we couldn't see that framework. But I mentioned the Negro Leagues to just say that that's what Hank Aaron grew up in. That's what he, that's what he came up in, and it was it prepared him and other people for a type of excellence that we saw in the Black schools, the Black elementary and high schools, the Black colleges, and the church. So there was a system of excellence and grooming that he came out of. It was Hank, the individual, who was very excellent in what he did, but he came out of a community that promoted excellence, and especially in that sport itself.
When I think about Hank Aaron, I think of how a narrative that doesn't change much.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about the death threats and the racist mail that he received when he was chasing the record, I think of the fact that here was a man being persecuted for just doing his job.
Right.
He wasn't trying to, at that time, I'm saying, he wasn't necessarily trying to date a white woman, that's fine if he wanted to do that. He wasn't trying to move into an all-white neighborhood. Again, he should have the right to do that if he wants to, but he was just doing his job.
Right.
And being persecuted for doing his job well. And it kind of makes me think or draw parallels to years later when Barack Obama was elected and the disrespect that he received. Obviously, he wouldn't have been in office if there weren't people other than African Americans who supported him, because we can't, select a president on our own. So he inspired people across, across race. But the people that did not want him because he was an African American, who did not care that he was biracial. They didn't care that he had a white mother and he was actually closer to his white mother than he was his Black father. They didn't care about any of that. They just saw a Black man.
Right.
And he was doing his job. He had excelled, Harvard Law School, Harvard Law Review, risen quickly and was just doing his job, and he was being persecuted. So to me, that's what I think about that narrative that just doesn't change, or it hasn't changed quickly enough.
Well, and the thing is that when you step into what are perceived to be white spaces, baseball, the American game, and it's okay to come in and spice it up, have the Willie Mays with the basket catch and that kind of stuff. But when you start chasing down the home run record, or you become the quarterback in football, those sorts of things, those are what people have deemed to be white spaces. And one of the whitest spaces was the White House or any political office. And we're getting away from Hank Aaron a little bit here, but when Booker T. Washington visited the White House and sat down and had lunch with Rose. Was the
I think it was Roosevelt. I'm trying to remember the president
Roosevelt. That helped to bring about the second emergence of the Klan, and all kinds of things. Violence broke out because he was in a white place and he had broken out of what people had perceived to be his place. So when we break out of those places that are perceived to be our place, when we move into white spaces, when we don't adopt enough humility in those spaces, then we can suffer with our lives.
Now, Andre, go ahead. I was going to ask you your perspective.
Another thing that Hank Aaron did is he spoke up and addressed the fact that Black players were on the field, but Black players were in the front. Black people were in the front office. Raising an issue with that. You can you can compare that to a situation with Barack Obama, because it's like, okay, we've ascended to the presidency, so now we're putting you on notice that we can arrive here. And Hank Aaron saying, it'd be nice if we saw more, black managers, black team owners, black general managers, so forth. It put the country on notice. And here's this: you can't negate the fact that this guy is a hell of a baseball player, but you're still invading a white space when you make statements like that. So he willfully put himself in the crosshairs for the sake of saying that, just because I'm black doesn't mean I don't have a voice. He used his voice. He used the platform that he gained from playing to be a voice for a community. And, here it is today, 2021, and you still don't see a lot of African-American managers. You still don't see a lot of African-American owners. You have Derek Jeter, who's a part owner of a team, but how many other Derek Jeters do we have?
Right.
Derek Jeter is another person who, ascended to the top of the game, World Series winner, Hall of Famer. But Hank Aaron did it when it was not okay. Now you can be, and Derek Jeter is mixed. So people look at Derek Jeter as Derek Jeter. You rarely hear people say Derek Jeter, the black guy.
Right.
There is no denying that Hank Aaron was black. His mama was black. His daddy was black. He was black.
Right.
And he used his skin, his ability to have a voice to say things need to change. And it's sad to say that he died without getting a chance to really see all of those changes come to fruition. Again, you have a minority owner or part owner in Derek Jeter, but that's it. You had was it Joe Morgan that was trying to get blacks, my generation, getting blacks to play baseball again.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We would play stickball. We would, on occasions, we played baseball, but in high school, and Ben Franklin, where I went, now I had uncles that played baseball. By the time I got to high school, it didn't exist. In the black communities, if you can dunk, if you can run for a touchdown, you can catch the ball, you're cool. The debate with the black quarterback, situations where they are the most talented person. I mean, Philadelphia Eagles, case in point, Jalen Hurts versus Carson Wentz. Who do you want? I want Jalen. It's not because he's black, it's because the kid doesn't get rattled.
Right.
Joe, when you think about Joe Morgan, what he did to reintroduce baseball to the black communities, it was Hank Aaron who said that not only should we have this in our communities, but we should be running these teams.
Mm.
And it's unfortunate. I thought Hank Aaron would be, the commissioner of baseball at some point. I really did, because, he was so respected. But you bring up a good point. First, I remember it was Jackie Robinson after he retired, and he started talking about, I'd love to see a black manager in baseball. Then Hank Aaron started talking about he'd love to see a black manager in baseball. And Dre, I don't know if you may not be old enough to remember this, or you may have seen it in, replays, but there was a Dodgers man. No, he wasn't a manager. He was like a coach. And I think it was Peter Brokaw asked him, why aren't there more blacks managing? He was a white man. He said, well, I think it's just a belief that, they don't have the mental capacity to manage and things like that nature. He said out of his mouth what a lot of them were thinking. He lost his job, which was, just a cleanup job. He probably had said that 1,000 times before to other people in baseball, but he hadn't said it on a national TV space. And so, it was interesting that statement was made back in like 1988. People were so-called outraged, but you haven't seen a tremendous change. You haven't seen a groundswell of change. And it's to the point, a lot of our, as you mentioned, a lot of blacks have left baseball, have really just, stopped playing baseball. So if it's not that many of us playing, it's probably not going to be that many of us managing, and owning. So unless that turns around at some point. So,
but you raised one other point that's interesting to me. The mental capacity. Blacks don't have the mental capacity. Instantly, I think, oh my gosh, that was something similar said to the Tuskegee Airmen.
mm-hmm.
That was something said about black quarterbacks.
Right.
That was something said about Black politicians. So it's a narrative that exists in this country that will never disappear,
Right.
because hate breeds hate. You know, you have somebody right now that's a stone cold racist, as racist they can come, a proud boy, you know, and they're teaching their kid, those people are bad, but we're good. So it's always going to exist. There's always going to be that degree of racism, the systemic racism that exists in this country, and it transcends into sports, pop culture, politics, family, you name it, it exists. And I think until
Education,
people, education,
just criminal justice.
until people finally come forward and agree and understand and outward say this happens, here's how we can fix it, it's always going to be a problem.
And that's a good segue into our next topic. Again, saluting the legend Hank Aaron. Today I was watching the news, and they had a video of Trump giving his speech when he was saying, okay, we're going to walk down to City Hall. Not City Hall, I'm sorry. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. And then there was an enhanced audio to show people in the crowd and how they were reacting. Yeah, we're going to storm the Capitol. And then one man was saying, using a lot of expletives and saying, we're going to take our goddamn country back. And so to me, that's always been code. We're going to take our country back. Take it back from who? Take it back from what? And you first started hearing that when Barack Obama was elected. I want my country back. And so now, I guess, and we've talked about this, the Democratic Party is seen as the African American Party, regardless of whether the president is African American or not. So now you still had this gentleman, and I'll use that term loosely, in that crowd yelling, we're going to take our goddamn country back. So despite the fact that I feel Trump kind of stoked the fires of racism, I don't know if he was a hardcore racist himself, or if he was just using what he knew, what was there, to get elected, the same way George Wallace did when he, again, he may have been a hardcore racist himself, but when he said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And then years later, when it wasn't fashionable, he said, well, before I talked about the roads and bridges and nobody wanted to hear it. So then when I talked segregation, I got elected. I took advantage of what was there. And he may that may be true. He may, just taking it, which is still deplorable. But so I said all that to say, despite what I thought of Trump, I think what a lot of people like-minded may have thought of Trump when he ran for president, with the things that he said, not just racist things, but talking about grabbing women by the vagina, made fun of disabled people, made fun of Senator McCain for being captured in war. Regardless of what you thought of the war or whatever the case may be, I wouldn't make fun of somebody that was captured, serving his country. Can we talk about, I guess, some of Trump's accomplishments? What do either of you feel that there were some positives that came out of his administration? And Dr. Holmes, we could start with you. Do you think there was anything that came out positive out of his administration? Because you don't have to be a good guy to do good things.
Well, no, I don't think positive things came out of his administration. I think a few positive things came out despite his administration. And I'll give you one example. In just last month, Trump signed off on a bill that that reversed something that occurred during the Clinton years. I used to teach in prison back in Delaware, in one of the prisons, and it was very interesting. Had some very excellent students, and what we knew from the data was that if an individual who received a degree in prison was only going to be about 10% likely, only 10% of those people who received a degree in prison were going to likely to reoffend. So they had a 90% success rate. But Clinton's crime bill wiped that out, and they got rid of the Pell Grants. And, you know, because you're in prison, you're not making money, so you automatically get those Pell Grants. And so the Pell Grants were restored to prisoners for college education in the last bill that went forth to deal with the pandemic. It came out of the House. It came out of the sort of Democratic side, but Trump signed it. So if you were going to look at some of the things that might showed up on Trump's positive ledger, you'd see that. But it was something that he didn't initiate, that it happened despite him, and even at the last minute, he tried to derail the whole bill. So I think basically what we see positive coming out of Trump are things that came out despite him, and because he was early on trying to get some brownie points in the community.
You know, that's a good point you make, because I remember when you brought Stokely Carmichael to Akron. He was going by as the name Kwame Ture at that time.
Right.
And I had an opportunity to sit and speak with him, and before he came up and spoke, and he made the point that I think at that time Mandela had just been freed by was it President, or was it de Klerk at that time? Yeah, right, by President de Klerk. And so we were looking at de Klerk as being, I guess, a better person than P.W. Botha. But Kwame Ture made the point that it's the blood of the people that made that happen.
Right.
You know, so de Klerk was just going with the social tie that had been created, you know, at that time. Whereas he was, as a moral being, he was no more moral than P.W. Botha. So that's an excellent point that you make, that yeah, Trump may have done some good things, but they may have come out of, you know, despite what he wanted to do. Right. You know, so excellent point. Dre, what do you think?
Even the same thing with Biden as well. I mean, it was this. It's the struggle in the street. It's the struggle that that's been going on in the street for the past couple of years, or year especially, that have pushed any of the positives that have come out of both sides, actually.
Good point.
It's one thing. I remember the State of the Union that he had done, and this was the night that Rush Limbaugh was bestowed in honor, and it kind of just took the whole night away from me. But that was also the night that Tuskegee Airman Colonel Charles McGee was promoted to Brigadier General McGee. I spent some time to conducting oral histories and doing an article on General McGee, and for me it was amazing to see, because too often we don't see people that look like us in a position that we aspire to be. You know, here's a man who is college educated, was a military pilot, you know, served in 3 wars as a pilot, has 409 or 406 career combat sorties that he flew. You know, so we don't get a chance to see people who look like him in these fields, and we often think that those are positions that are just specific to white pilots, white servicemen. You know, but here's a Black guy who has a record that will never be surpassed, you know, and nobody talks openly about it because it takes away from the concept of Top Gun, you know, the elite white pilot. You know, you don't want to talk about the Black pilot because that takes away from the white narrative that exists in this country. And it was something, I don't know who got in Trump's ear to do it. I don't know how it came to be, but it happened. And for me, you know, I was watching that night, and I remember live tweeting and just, you know, oh man, it's full of wind. And then I see General McGee stand up and salute. And I don't know if somebody was cutting onions. I don't know what happened in his house, but the tears were flowing because it was a proud moment for me.
Right.
You know, I saw somebody who I looked up to and was getting this honor that should have happened years ago.
All right. So you see that as a positive of just Trump's administration. Just
I see it as a positive for
that's one thing.
It's something that should have been done a long time ago.
Let me ask you both about something specific. And this could go both ways. That's why it's a good talking point. He pardoned Kwame Kilpatrick. or commuted his sentence, or whatever you want to call it. I think Kwame Kilpatrick was about to spend 28 years in prison. Now, I don't know all the details of everything Kwame did in Detroit. I've seen documentaries, I've seen his featured on American Greed. So I don't know how people were impacted or who was impacted. In other words, if there were a lot of people in our community that were really adversely impacted, that were hurt by the things that he did. So let me pose this question. Do you see it as a good thing? Okay, Trump, you gave a brother a break, or do you see it as a negative? Like, okay, yeah, he's just helping out another politician like himself, regardless of color.
Well, Kwame Kilpatrick had done a bunch of stuff, but he had gotten a certainly very long sentence for the stuff he had done. The sentence, I think, was a much more draconian than he deserved, or what a politician would usually get. So I think that was a good thing, I think that was a good thing that occurred. And there's some other things that happened, that were probably on the plus side, but every president is going to do something on the plus side. When I look at the whole thing, I have to weigh all of these pieces, right?
Mm-hmm.
And weigh, the positives versus the negatives versus what's the overall outcome. But definitely, I believe that Kwame, I think that he really didn't need that length of sentence.
Okay.
Now, what we do see with Trump is that in his pardons and commutations and whatnot, he goes for the higher profile folks.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of numbers, the numbers were really kind of low in terms of absolute numbers of pardons. And he had quite a few toward the end. But you go for the high profile that gets you a lot of attention, that gets you support. And you don't necessarily get that the unknown folks who are who in large numbers that would have a bigger impact in their communities.
Like Johnny Cochran, you once said, he was after he became so famous for the OJ case, he's like, I'm not as proud of the OJs as I am about the no J's, people that just had no name at all, and some of the civil rights cases that he won, because of course he wouldn't have been representing OJ Simpson if he hadn't, laid that groundwork. Now, Dre, you look like you were ready to bust when I brought up Kwame Kilpatrick. So I want to hear what you have to say.
So I got earfuls on top of earfuls with this one. My wife is from Detroit, and my father-in-law still lives in Detroit. And a mentor of mine in journalism, Walter Middlebrook, was at the paper in Detroit at the time when the trial was happening. And I remember the first time I'd seen Kwame when the trial began. I'm like, wow, you're like the first person that ever sat in Oprah's audience or on Oprah's stage, and she gave you a name of the hip hop mayor. You're the first one to fall from grace. So him being commuted or whatever pardon, however, because a lot of the literature, the language that's used in these pardons has opened the door for more charges if need be with some of the people that Trump has pardoned. But in Kwame's case, he's still on the hook for the restitution money that's owed. But he's out of jail, and the first thing he did is went to his mama's house in Georgia. So, I look at what he did, the allegations and so forth, and I wasn't there for any of it, so it's hard for me to say. But I know people in Detroit. I started looking on social media; they were loving it. He's out. My man is out. He's, and the first thing that stood out to me was that Oprah line, the hip hop mayor, and then you see Lil Wayne, and then you see Kodak Black. And it's like Trump, he pardoned people in the Black community that specific people would look to because of the words hip hop. I'm just putting it out there like that. My wife, I remember I said, hey, Trump pardoned Kwame. And she said, Kwame who? And I said, you're a mayor. And she said, oh, all right, she went back to sleep. So for her, it was like, I don't care. But other people, you would have thought that Detroit just won the Super Bowl, World Series, and NBA Finals at one time, and the Stanley Cup. You got to throw that in there for them. But it was amazing for me to see the amount of people who completely just dismissed anything that he had done and said, we're happy that he's out because he's Black. And that was one of the things that was trending a lot on social media.
Wow. And it's funny, you both make that point about the high profile. When I always found it interesting that when Trump first was elected, and we're going to move on from Trump in a minute. I guess we only have about 15 minutes. But when Trump was first elected, I looked at the people he invited, the African Americans that he invited to the White House: Jim Brown, Steve Harvey, Kanye West. Did Lil Wayne go? I mean, but it was like athletes and entertainers. Athletes, entertainers. He didn't invite Michael Eric Dyson, regardless of whether you agree with some of the people I'm about to mention or not. Michael Eric Dyson or Cornel West or Louis Farrakhan or Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson. He didn't invite anybody with a political base. Or a political perspective. He invited athletes and entertainers, high profile, like Dr. Holmes said. And then also, in my opinion, like that's all he could see. Like I see them as athletes and entertainers because we do well in that space, but that's just not all we are, So it was interesting to me that that's who he invited, unless there were other political figures that were invited that I didn't hear about. All I heard about was Jim Brown, Kanye West.
Yeah. Can I say something? When I hear Donald Trump, you know what I think of? I think of white sports radio. White sports radio. He uses that same language, and the shock jocks, like the Imuses and the Stearns, Howard Stearns. He uses that same language, that same approach when he's talking politics. So he sounds to me like many of these old WIP, some of those WIP, since Philadelphia radio show hosts that were more outrageous,
right?
Calling folks a fraud, this, that, and the other, and saying the most outrageous thing like the shock jock. So he comes out of that radio thing, and they always racialize Black athletes in a certain kind of way. And he definitely wouldn't invite a LeBron James, who those kind of folks to speak or to although they're at the top of the game. He invited some people who were a little lesser, actually, or has-beens, or that kind of thing. People who had their best behind them.
Right, or who were singing his praises.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I heard Al Sharpton say on a radio show, regardless of how he criticized George W. Bush, George W. Bush was always gracious enough to invite him to the White House, invite him to events. He understood it was politics. Some people agree with you, some people don't, but you can't really improve by just surrounding yourself constantly with yes men. Right. Just like we go back and forth with ideas and, talk about things. It's not about just us always agreeing all the time. You grow and improve, sometime with that friction. So in the last 10 minutes we have, all right, I want to talk about some of Biden's executive orders. In just his couple of days in office, he's done about 20 executive orders. And for those watching the show, we're in such a partisanship in this country that when somebody is elected that you want, we just ride with them, ride or die with them, no matter what. And if somebody is elected that you don't want, we just kind of spend the next 4 years tearing them down. But if you're interested in what someone accomplishes in office, I have a website to give you, federalregister.gov. Go to federalregister.gov and it will list all of the executive orders that each president did every year. And I found this because I was trying to find out information on some of the things Trump did and Biden's done, and everything was so biased. Everything was opinionated. It was either someone tearing down what Biden did or openly praising. So I wanted kind of something fair. So I'm gonna throw it out to both of you. What do you think about one of his executive orders, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government? Have you both heard of this one? All right. Any opinions?
Well, let me just say this one real quick thing in terms of we're seeing more because of the level of partisanship that's occurring now. We're seeing more executive orders being issued in these last couple of presidencies that have been issued in a long time, and unless you have 3 presidencies in a row, these executive orders can kind of go away. For instance, the what we call affirmative action came out of executive orders during the LBJ, Lyndon Johnson's administration and so forth. But now we're seeing this executive orders that might only stand for 4 years, and then they'll be reversed by the. And this is a fairly new phenomenon. Obama started using them toward the end of his presidency because he couldn't get anything through the Congress, and similarly with Trump and Biden is going to have a rough time getting anything through Congress, but he's got to reverse a lot of this negative, crazy stuff. So what's going to happen with that one you mentioned is that how we write up the regs, or how you write up the regulations in the various agencies are going to determine how that stuff actually happens. And some stuff is going to happen, but at the end of the day, you're going to need legislation to really strengthen this stuff. So I think Biden is understanding that he's there largely because of the African community to vote, but also, how he got placed there within the whole selection process. So I think he's under the gun there, and also with the climate people, also with the environmentalists and so forth. So he's doing it right now through this, but this won't hold up over the long term. And you have to have legislation.
Excellent point.
Dr. Holmes, you bring up a good point about climatologists and so forth. One of the executive orders focuses on having federal agencies work meaningfully with indigenous tribal communities. First thing when I thought of was some research that I had done looking at the Mashpee Wampanoag Indians in Massachusetts, as well as the Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina. These are 2 recognized tribal communities where you have extensive damage that has been done by climate change that has impacted their cultural heritage in a manner of food waste. Having the ability to have federal agencies meet with these tribal communities, I believe is a good thing. And I hope that it leads to some strengthened legislation that will make sure that these communities are allowed to do things that traditionally have been done by their tribes to maintain their cultural heritage in this country. As victims, and I think it's safe to call them victims because of land that was stolen and things that were put in place that have impacted their communities for several years now. But the Mashpees some years ago wanted to have the right to do controlled burns, and local government said no. And eventually, when they allowed it to happen, things that were missing from the Mashpees community, certain types of berries, came back. So you have elements of their cultural heritage returning. And when I think about the Eastern Band of Cherokee, they're not too far from Tennessee. There's a dam that's built there that impacts the flow of the trout. They feed off of specific types of trout that are unique to their cultural heritage. So having things put in place where you can address the impacts of climate change, sea level rise with these indigenous communities is very necessary, but it should go beyond the fact that you have an executive order to say it. Back that up with some strong legislation, because at the end of the day, no one should have their cultural heritage changed. And these individuals have had theirs completely taken away. And I think it's safe to say they've been raped of some of the things that that are theirs, and rightfully theirs, because this country was theirs. They were invaded. They lost land. They lost cultural heritage. They were whitewashed. They lost things that I'm not saying we as blacks haven't lost, but this was their country and it was inhabited by other people and taken. So I think that it's the least that can be done is to establish some kind of strong legislation that will not only address climate change in this country, but make it specific to these indigenous tribes.
Good point. So so you both sound like you're happy about certain things Biden's done, but we're just going to need some legislation. Like the executive orders aren't going to hold up, because I was reading about the executive orders. They can be overturned, and it's interesting how when Trump came into office, and we could close out with this, when Trump came in office, it seemed like his whole mission was to undo everything President Obama had done, and now, Biden's coming in, and understandably so, wants to undo some things Trump has done, as far as executive order. So at some point, we're going to have to get beyond the partisanship, and get some legislation going, because even now with this Trump impeachment, a lot of the Republicans, are saying, well, they're not going to vote for impeachment, although they know that was inciting a riot and that was wrong. And if anybody else would have done that, they would be like, oh, this is terrible, because every time there's a reason for African Americans to riot, we're told to remain peaceful, even, and I think I said this last week, even when football players were kneeling on the field, Trump called them sons of bitches and said, get those sons of bitches off the field. But now we're talking about inciting a riot, and his Republicans are saying they wouldn't vote for impeachment. So it just shows that this hardcore partisanship is something that we're going to have to get past. And like you both said, lead to some legislation, or it's just going to be presidents following each other, undoing what the previous administration had done, So Dr. Holmes, before we close out, let me give you the last word.
Well, I think we have to go even beyond that, in this sense that what we're seeing is that right now, in this last few presidencies, we've had more impeachments. And if you add Richard Nixon to the mix as an impeachment, because he resigned before an impeachment was coming, we've had more impeachments in the past 50 years than we've had in the rest of the country. So what we're really seeing, and we've seen this by this partisanship, what we're really seeing is a really shaking up in terms of the country. And it's either going to go one direction or another. It's either going to go into a kind of a fascist kind of a thing, which is what Trump is pushing it, and what the Republican Party is actually pushing, or is it going into something else? And ultimately, it's going to boil down to where the masses of the people, which way they go. This is why I'm a Pan-Africanist, in the sense that we're so outnumbered in this country in a lot of ways that we have to look beyond these borders in order to see where our future is going to rest. And right now, we need to have a firm, strong African presence in other parts of the world, especially in Africa, that's going to be able to be there when this thing falls one way or the other.
Right.
Because we're going through a really shaking up. It's really going through almost like a kind of it's going through this really jittery thing, and it's either going to break away from its moorings or snap back to its moorings. And if it snaps back, it'll snap back into it began what we call in a systems theory, in a certain kind of theory, the initial systems of a system. A system, even when it's under stress, always tends to go back to that initial state. So you can stretch that system very much, but it'll tend to go back to the state. But now we're going through this kind of period where it's going to really wiggling back and forth. And but the initial system was what? Enslavement of our people, and the genocide of Native people and the theft of their land. So we're seeing that really come out as people try to push it back to what they call their country. We take our country back.
Right.
And we see this other stress and pushing going the other way. So we'll see which way it snaps. When it snaps, what happens.
All right. And I hate to end on that because that makes me want to start talking some more, but we can continue that one next week. So for all of you that are listening and watching, we want to thank you for supporting us. Go to our website, fullcircleshow.com, and you'll see all our social media sites on the website. Make sure that you like and follow us on social media. So we thank you for supporting us again, and we'll see you next week.